Previously on Blunty3000's YouTube channel. Hello again, I am Blunty, and a little while back I teased you with a little sneak peek at this Sigma macro lens, attached at the time via a couple of lens adapters to my Pentax Q for a little bit of wacky fun time adventuring, and pretty much because I could. Well, now it's time to see how this beastie performs out in the real world and attached to a camera it's actually designed to work with, in this case my Canon 60D. Now, just before we dive in proper, I know there are many of you out there who are still photo newbies, hungry for information, so let's cover some basics. If you're already a more serious and accomplished snapper, just bear with us a few seconds while we get through this, okay? Okay. So what makes a macro lens different? What makes a macro lens a macro lens? Well, at the core of it, they've been designed to give you an extremely close focusing distance. They're often a bit pricier, bigger, and usually noticeably heavier than the standard non-macro prime lens equivalents, because there simply has to be more glass inside them to let them do what they do and what other lenses can't. A macro lens is also not limited to just shooting close-ups. They also cover all the regular duties of normal lenses as well, and many serve double duty as quite impressive telephoto lenses too, or even for portraiture. A macro lens is also capable of projecting the image onto the image sensor at equal to or greater than life size, and this is called the reproduction ratio. Well, the fact is, outside of arguing about such things on photography forums, you really don't need to understand things like reproduction ratios all that much to be able to use macro lenses and thoroughly enjoy exploring the world of often unnoticed teeny-weeny stuff. Now then, before we get on to some more pictures and talk about the performance, let's take a walk around the hardware. Naturally, being a Sigma lens, it is available also in Nikon or Sigma mounts. So if you live in one of the other DSLR cams, you can slap this glass on your body and snap till your shutter button finger is blistered and raw. As you'd expect, you lucky buggers with a Nikon will get a version with a proper aperture ring, while the Canon mount, the one that I had in for review, of course only offers up electronically controlled aperture. The lens comes with a very useful lens hood, which of course is properly reversible to make it easier and more compact to pack and carry. Up top is your focus distance scale, nothing remarkable here, easy to read, and while the focus wheel will continue to spin past the extremes, there is a noticeable tactile feedback when you have reached the end, so you know instantly and precisely when you've reached the limits at either end. Something sadly lacking in many focus-by-wire arrangements. An arrangement of 3 switches on the lens body give you the ability to switch between auto and manual focus, of course, but it should also be noted that the lens has been designed so you can override the autofocus with the focus wheel if you need to as well. Another multi-position switch lets you limit your focus to certain ranges, which can speed up focus acquisition a hell of a lot, especially in getting those close-up macro shots, as you can stop the lens hunting through its entire range and tell it to only worry about the closest stuff. And lastly, you can switch the optical stabilization off or into one of 2 modes. Position 1 stabilizes the movement both horizontally and vertically, while the second position compensates for movement in the vertical plane only, which lets you, for example, pan the camera in video mode without any weirdness and interference from the stabilization system, an extremely useful option to have. The lens body itself is quite solid and weighty, but not what I'd call heavy. Macro lenses are almost always heavier than their non-macro prime counterparts, simply due to all the extra glass in there required to get them doing what other lenses can't, as I mentioned before, but I did at one point do a full 10-hour-long day of shooting with it and lugging it around across all kinds of terrain, and the weight never became a noticeable burden. Alright then, that's enough of that. Time to see what happens when we actually slap this critter on a camera and let some light stream through it. To give it its proper and full mouthful of a moniker, the Sigma 105mm f2.8 EXDGOS-HSM macro is designed for use with full-frame digital SLR cameras. But of course it can also be used with cameras with APS-C size sensors too, like the Canon 60D I'm testing it with. But be aware, as always, using it on a crop sensor camera will give you a narrower effective field of view, in this case about the same as a 168mm lens. Something else common to macro photography, which is easiest explained away by saying physics did it, is that you're often dealing with a very narrow depth of field, which can present both a challenge and a blessing. Because when you're dealing with such a narrow depth of field with objects so close to the lens, if they happen to be critters skittling about or flowers doing their wibbly-wobbly thing in the breeze, focus can be extremely hard to nail. But when you get it right, they can often be some of the most striking and interesting images you'll ever take. Almost every shot in this review was done handheld on a fairly dreary day, often in the shade, but the autofocus on the Sigma was relatively fast and it locked on reliably in almost every situation, even when I thought I was giving it a challenge. And in many cases, because I was shooting handheld, the optical stabilization meant the difference between getting the shot and winding up with a fuzzy mess. But of course, the other side to having the ability to use a very narrow depth of field is the ability to really isolate your subjects and make them really pop without a busy, detailed background pulling the viewer's eye away. And the bokeh, a word used to describe the aesthetic appeal of the out of focus areas with the Sigma, is very pleasant indeed. It's soft and organic, and even with these busy, leafy, twiggy backgrounds, which can often look, well, a bit ugly and harsh. The lens performed really well across the aperture range, staying crisp and without introducing any significant aberrations or other unexpected issues. Even in shots with harsh, bright highlight shot wide open, there was little to no sign of chromatic aberration or that awful purple fringing you can get in these high contrast edges. It was bloody impressive, actually. From wide open to stopped right down to its limit of f/22, it remained absolutely dependable. The optical stabilization motors making some of the shots possible are a bit noisy and have a slight high-pitched whine to them while active. It's not distractingly so, but you can certainly hear them while they're doing their job. Same goes for the autofocus motor, not what you'd call silent, but far from being actually noisy. And in both cases you can feel them at work through the body of the lens. None of this is really any kind of issue unless you're shooting video, in which case, if you need live audio, an off-camera mic and recording deck easily skirts around the issue completely. And while we're on the subject of video, the Sigma performed superbly, but you really want to stick with manual focus as the lens, or for that matter my 60D, aren't very good at autofocus in video mode. Aside from the noise, it has a tendency to hunt back and forth a lot before locking, if it locks. Much of this is the camera body's fault. We have to be very clear about this. The 60D is shitty at autofocus in video mode, with any lens. But once you take proper manual control for yourself, you can get some truly great looking video of subjects you'd never dream of being able to get with a standard lens. This little guy, for instance, tiny, and I mean bloody tiny. I had trouble seeing him with the naked eye, for crying out loud, and I had a hell of a time sneaking up on him to get this shot, to be honest. Not to mention the blindingly narrow depth of field made nailing the focus a fun challenge. But there's no denying it, you'd never get this shot with your bog standard kit lens. It's simply impossible. To even attempt would be insanity. It's worth noting too that the lens is splash proof, so if, like me, you're shooting on a drizzly day, you can get on with the job at hand without having to worry about the lens's survival. Indeed, the lens in general has a very solid, confidence-inducing feel to the build. You get the definite sense that it'll have a long and useful lifetime, suffering the rigours of a life in the field with a smile and not just a coddled existence confined to a studio. Aside from my own general inexperience with shooting with a proper macro lens, which meant much of my time was spent gleefully experimenting and fiddling and quite often failing, I have to be honest, the Sigma performed marvellously. It did precisely what I asked it to do each and every shutter release, even if what I asked it to do was the wrong thing to get the shot. And it was generally a very agreeable bit of kit to use, delivering crispy, clean and sharp detail all the way down. See what I did there? Down. Get it? Puntastic. And you know, even if I do say myself, I got a few bloody terrific photographs with it. Most of which I'd not have even had a hope in hell of achieving with any other lens in my collection. So, would I recommend this lens? Absolutely. Price is going to vary when, where and how you buy it and with what currency, of course, blah de blah blah blah. So you're on your own for a quick Google to find out what it'll cost you in your currency. Expect it to be somewhere in the middle ground of average lens prices for DSLRs. Pound for pound, its price versus performance ratio makes it pretty good value in my opinion. Thanks for watching. I am Blunty, and I'll catch you next time.